Think about the last time someone told you they loved you. Maybe it was this morning. Maybe it was a text, casual and quick, almost automatic. Love you, bye. Easy, effortless. The kind of thing that gets said so often it barely registers. Now imagine growing up in a house where that sentence was never spoken. Not once. Not on birthdays, not after nightmares, not during the quiet moments that beg for it. The house was functional. There was food on the table, the lights stayed on. Maybe your parents worked hard and gave you everything you needed, except that. 3 words, 8 letters, nothing. And here's what's strange. Many people who grew up in those homes will tell you, it was fine. We just weren't that kind of family. They'll say it casually, almost defensively, like they're explaining that they didn't have a pool growing up. No big deal, move on. But the psychology tells a very different story. And that's what we're going to explore today. Before you could understand a single word, your brain was already learning something far more fundamental. Am I safe here? Do I matter? Is the world a place that responds to me? This is what developmental psychologists call attachment theory, the framework pioneered by John Bowlby in the mid-20th century. The basic idea is deceptively simple. The way our earliest caregivers respond to us, or don't respond, becomes the emotional blueprint we carry into every relationship we will ever have. Not a metaphorical blueprint, a literal neurological one. The patterns of connection or disconnection you experienced as a child become wired into the very architecture of your nervous system. And words matter enormously in this process. Not because children are sitting there parsing syntax, but because verbal expressions of love are a form of emotional attunement. They tell a child, I see you, you exist, you are worth naming. When that verbal attunement is absent, something quiet and significant happens. The child doesn't conclude, my parents forgot to say it. The child concludes, on a level far below conscious awareness, maybe I'm not the kind of person who gets loved out loud. That belief, unspoken, unexamined, becomes a lens through which everything else gets filtered. Let me introduce you to 3 hypothetical people, all adults, all of whom grew up without ever hearing those words. Watch how differently the same absence shaped them. The first person became an overachiever, exceptional at work, celebrated by colleagues, always the first to arrive and the last to leave. On the surface, wildly successful. But ask them why they work so hard and listen carefully to what they don't say. They're not building towards something, they're running away from something. The quiet fear that without proof of value, without achievement, without being needed, they might just disappear. Love in their household was implied through approval, so they learned to earn it. And they've been earning it ever since. The second person went in a completely different direction. They became the caretaker, the friend everyone calls at 2 a.m., the partner who anticipates every need, the person who would rather go without than ask for something. On the surface, generous and selfless. Underneath, a different calculation. If I make myself indispensable, no one will leave. If I give enough, maybe I'll finally receive. This is what attachment researchers call anxious attachment, and it's essentially love anxiety, a constant background hum of fear that connection is always one wrong move away from disappearing. The third person built walls, not out of cruelty, but out of a very intelligent piece of childhood logic. If you don't let people in, they can't leave. And if they can't leave, they can't hurt you. This is avoidant attachment. And what's fascinating about it is that avoidant people often describe themselves as independent, self-sufficient, not needing much from others. And they genuinely believe that, because the mind is extraordinarily good at reframing its own wounds as personality traits. 3 people, same absence, 3 completely different adaptations, all of them rational, all of them trying to survive. Here's something that might genuinely surprise you. Neurologically, emotional neglect, which is what the absence of expressed love technically is, activates the same brain regions as physical pain. A study from the University of Michigan found that social rejection lights up the anterior cingulate cortex, the same area that processes physical hurt. Your brain, quite literally, does not distinguish between being burned and being emotionally overlooked. This is why telling someone, it was just words, you weren't abused, misses the point entirely. The brain doesn't grade trauma by category. It registers the signal. And the signal of consistent emotional silence says, something is wrong, brace yourself. And so, the nervous system braces, sometimes for decades. What's also worth knowing is that the absence of "I love you" rarely exists in isolation. It usually comes alongside an absence of eye contact during distress, a lack of physical comfort when things went wrong, a general atmosphere of love as performance rather than love as presence. The words are the visible symptom of a deeper emotional climate. But they're also, and this is important, one of the clearest, most memorable markers of it, because language is how humans make experience conscious. When the experience never gets named, it never fully exists in a form the child can process, carry, or eventually release. Here's where it gets intergenerational. Because the vast majority of parents who never said "I love you" to their children were themselves never told, this isn't an excuse, it's a pattern, a transmission. Emotional literacy, it turns out, is learned, not innate. If you grew up in a household where love was demonstrated through provision, through discipline, through showing up, but never through words, you may genuinely not have a template for saying it. Not because you don't feel it, but because no one ever showed you that feelings were things you were allowed to say out loud. Many cultures have historically treated verbal emotional expression as weakness, excess, or sentimentality. I don't need to say it, they know. And on one level, maybe they do. But knowing something intellectually and feeling it in your body are two entirely different experiences. A child who is never told "I love you" often grows into an adult who intellectually understands they were cared for, but who feels, in the body, in the nervous system, in the part that doesn't respond to logic, somehow hollow, somehow unconfirmed. This is one of the reasons therapy for adults with emotionally unavailable parents can feel so strange at first. Because the therapist might say, your parents clearly loved you in their own way, and the client agrees, and still cries. Not because the love wasn't real, but because a part of them is still waiting to hear it. So what do you do with this? If you grew up in a house where those words were absent, and you recognize yourself somewhere in that overachiever, that caretaker, that wall builder, what now? First, know this. The adaptations you developed were not weaknesses. They were intelligence. Your nervous system looked at its environment and made the most rational decisions it could with the information available. The overachiever learned that effort earns safety. The caretaker learned that generosity builds connection. The wall builder learned that distance prevents pain. All of them were right in that specific context. The work now is not to shame those strategies, but to recognize that you're no longer living in that context, and that you get to update the software. Second, the words can come from you now. One of the most quietly powerful things that happens in therapy and self-work is the moment a person learns to say, to themselves, to others, what was never said to them. Not because it fixes the past, but because language is how we make things real. And you deserve to live in a reality where love is spoken, not just implied. There's a kind of grief that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with a funeral or a clear before and after. It's the grief of something that was never there to begin with. The absence of something you needed so quietly and completely that you almost didn't notice you were missing it. If that's the grief you've been carrying, the kind that lives in the way you work too hard or give too much or keep everyone at arm's length, I want you to know that grief is real and it's allowed. You don't have to protect the silence that shaped you. Drop a comment if any part of this landed for you. I read them, genuinely. And if you know someone who needs to hear this today, share it with them. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is hand someone the language for what they've been feeling for years. I'll see you in the next one.